Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, to Your Excellency, Secretary General of the Council of Europe, Excellencies, ambassadors from different countries which are representative your countries in Prague. We are very honored and proud to welcome the honor guests here visiting in Prague that have a time for a lecture and discussing together with us. Mr. Thorson Jagland, as I mentioned, Secretary General of the Council of Europe, which is coming together to us. We feeling that as a tradition on the universities, it is the rights, freedom, movement, and it is some main items and crucial points for the Europe, not only as a council, to looking for the human rights, freedom of all people, and also to the rules of law, and connecting the people in Europe from the east to west, from the north to south. And I think that at that time we must be joining together to feeling the classical spirits of these priorities as the human rights and principle of the democracy, which coming from the thousands years ago from the ancient cultures on our continent. And the Council of Europe, it is the most prestigious institution in Europe, which is looking for this, I think, the basic parts of our life, of our society. And I warmly welcome Your Excellency Jagland for his speech on a topic connecting to the security, democratic security, and its Europe, and our responsibility for our, not these days, but we must looking for the future. Please.
Do I speak from here or?
As you like, from here or.
Mr. Rector, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a great honor to be at this university, this prestigious university, the oldest one in the Czech Republic. And standing here in this hall, it's indeed also very moving. I know that Václav Havel has spoken here. He did that actually at a Council of Europe event. There was an event which we had here for Minister of Education, speaking about the Holocaust and genocide, and of course human rights. And there were some very important quotes from Havel at the time he spoke about, which is I think one of the major challenges Europe is facing today, namely that so many or too many people are obsessed with the purity of a society, that we should be only one ethnic group in one nation, and all the others are a threat to us. And of course this is a major challenge for all of us. It's also for me very moving to come back to Prague. I remember very well, this is actually a very nice story, but it's also a telling story. I came here right after the revolution, and because Willy Brandt, he asked me to go here to establish contacts with the Social Democrats. And he said that you have to go insist to see the People's House in Prague. The Social Democratic parties had these houses around in most of the European countries. It belonged to the Social Democratic Party, and so you have to go to see this house, so we get it back to our party. And well, I did that. The first thing I did was, there was a Lenin museum there in the People's House. And I reported this back to Willy Brandt, and he was so furious, so obsessed. How could I do this crime? Taking over house and making it into a Lenin's house, Lenin Museum. Some years later, I came back to Prague as Foreign Minister of Norway, and I was going to make a speech. I didn't know where, but I was going to make a speech. And then they brought me to this house, the People's House, and it was now returned to the Social Democratic Party. So it was very moving for me. And of course, it's a telling story of what happened here. And when I came back from Prague the first time I was here, after the revolution, I wrote a book which I called My European Dream. And the dream was that Europe should be united, and I referred particularly to the Czechoslovakia at the time, that we used to call it Eastern Europe, but actually it is the Middle Europe, Middle Europa we talked about, and now Czechoslovakia returned to Europe, became a normal state in Europe, and it's of course a fantastic journey that we have seen since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Velvet Revolution and democratization in the heart of Europe. And standing here today in the Czech Republic, being a full party to Europe in the European Union, in the Council of Europe, it's indeed very moving, I would say. Now, what is the Council of Europe? Actually, it was started right after the war. It was Winston Churchill who said it, that the peace in Europe had to be based on human rights and the rule of law, because what we saw before the war was exactly the opposite. The breakdown of human rights and the rule of law in Germany, which led to Nazism and the whole catastrophe at the European continent. So the new peace had to be built on human rights and the rule of law. And as he said that where rule of law stops, tyranny begins. This we have seen again and again, and war comes. So therefore we got the European Convention on Human Rights, and this convention has established a huge machinery in Strasbourg in order to get member states to uphold the standards and principles in the European Convention on Human Rights. We have monitoring bodies, the Parliamentary Assembly, and on top of this huge machinery we have the Court of Human Rights, which is unprecedented in history, unprecedented in the world today, because it means that 800 million people today can go to an international court if they believe that their own authorities are not in compliance with the European Convention on Human Rights. And indeed they do. I think more than 50,000 people a year goes to this court, and the ruling of the court is it's an obligation for every member state to implement this judgment. So in that sense we have rule of law at the European level, within, of course, the remits of the European Convention on Human Rights. So it means that this court has the final word when it comes to human rights and rule of law principles. So this means we have rule of law at the European level. It's incredibly important, and actually it constituted the basis for the unification of Europe. Well, it started when the convention was created, but of course it became incredibly important after the fall of the Berlin Wall, because without this convention, European Union could not have taken on board new members, because it was only the convention that constituted the basis for accession to the European Union. The European Union could not have taken on board new members without having these members to comply with the European Convention, and the European Union didn't have the legal basis for doing this themselves. It was the European Convention that constituted this. So it was very important in order to help all the new member states to come to Europe, to adhere to the standards in the European values enshrined in this convention. Now, I refer to what are the challenges we have today in Europe. There are many. I refer to what Václav Havel said in this very room when he referred to this threat that has become much more visible today, namely that we are seeing widespread xenophobic tendencies, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, petty nationalism, I would say, we are witnessing growing many places. So there is a kind of opposite tendency, which we saw after the fall of the Berlin Wall, namely that too many people are, so to say, looking at more ideas that would again split our nations and the whole continent. So this is a huge challenge that we are witnessing. I saw some time ago the European Union had made a review asking people how they look upon immigration. As you know, as all of you know, Europe is totally dependent on immigration because the population is growing older, and we need therefore new people coming to the continent to do the jobs that need to be done. But at the same time, which I refer to, there is also a growing opposition to this in many of our societies. So the European Union asked how people look upon this, and 60% didn't accept the immigration that takes place. So you see there is a big gap between what we need and what people accept in terms of new people coming to the continent. And this gap has probably been growing the last years. So I think this is one of the major challenges that the continent is facing. Another one is related to our basic principles, rule of law and human rights and anti-discrimination. We call Council of Europe has built upon the concept of democratic security. What is that, democratic security? Well, if you talk about security of a nation, then there are many things that can secure a nation. It's sovereignty and its territorial integrity. Of course, it's incredibly important to have a strong economy. It's important to have a national defense. And many believe that it's important also, of course, and I believe in that too, to be a part of a wider military alliance. But there is a third element which is becoming more and more visible, and that is trust in the society. That a nation has solid institutions that people can trust, and that there is trust between the people and the political leaders. If we don't have such a system based on checks and balances, solid institutions with checks and balances, separation of power, then what do we get? Distrust, and very often, I would say, always we get corruption, misuse of power, mismanagement of power, and ultimately also we have seen revolutions coming out of such a situation. So this is democratic security, that we have institutions with balance of power, separation of power, so that we get political leaders that listen to the people, that do not misuse their power, and We have seen around not only Europe, but around us also, how it went when they didn't have such a system in place. For instance, in Tunisia, how did the revolution in Tunisia start? Why did the people in Tunisia go to the streets? It was because they didn't have democratic security. It was the opposite. There was a system which was corrupted, where there was misuse of power, mismanagement of power, and at the end of the day, people went to the streets, made a revolution. Fortunately, in Tunisia, by the way, by the help of the Council of Europe's expertise, this revolution turned out to be a positive one, at least for the time being. They were able to get the main political forces to agree on a constitution and to build such institutions which I was talking about. But elsewhere, where we got also revolutions, what came out of this? In Libya, in Syria, in Egypt, we have seen the biggest chaos after the Second World War. So I don't say that I don't want to see revolutions, but it would be better to have reformed these countries if the rulers had understood that there was a need for opening up, like one did here in Czechoslovakia at the time. If one understood that there was a need for reforms to open up for democracy, rule of law at an early stage, one could have avoided the chaos that we are witnessing now in the Middle East, and which is now influencing Europe in a very, very dangerous way, I would say. We can look at Ukraine. Why did the revolution in Ukraine come? I fully understand, and there was unavoidable that the revolution in Ukraine came. But why did it come? The same thing as in Tunisia. The system was corrupted. There was no independent judiciary. The media were owned by the oligarchs. And the oligarchs went to the parliament to get a seat there, to get impunity. So there was no independent parliament. So can you imagine we saw what we got when we don't have an independent judiciary, when we don't have freedom of media, when we don't have an autonomous, strong parliament. They got corruption, mismanagement of power, misuse of power. This should be one of the richest countries in Europe, the richest soil in Europe. But it became bankrupt. So the revolution came, and the weakness of this country during these days was used by the Russian Federation in an unacceptable, illegal way to grab Crimea and to start intervening in eastern Ukraine. So this is democratic security, and this is what we are doing now. We started with this actually already before the revolution, because we saw all the weaknesses of the institutions in Ukraine. So we moved our expertise to Kiev at an early stage, long before other international organizations, in order to help them to reform legislation. A large part of the legislation in Ukraine was from the communist time, the judiciary was from the communist time. And remember one thing, when the revolution happened at the Maidan Square, what did the young people say? Well, of course, they wanted to see the association agreement with the European Union come through. But there was another very strong signal which was connected to this, namely that they didn't trust the judiciary, they didn't trust the prosecutor general, they didn't trust the police. They wanted to do away with it immediately because it was corrupted. This was a demand from Maidan. And it was, of course, connected to association agreement with the European Union, because they understood if Ukraine became a part of the European Union, one had to do away with this system. So we started helping them to reform at an early stage, and now we are there to continue with this. We have a big team of 40 people in Kiev. We have 3 people sitting in the Constitutional Commission, which President Poroshenko appointed. I have my own special representative in Verkhovna Rada to help them to build the new laws based on the European Convention. We are now deploying 25 experts in all the 25 oblasts in Ukraine to help them with decentralization, which is a necessity in Ukraine. All this in order to build a solid state, solid institutions, non-corrupted institutions, based on separation of power, checks and balances. And I think this is, of course, in order to secure Ukraine's sovereignty in the future. This is indispensable, because one cannot secure the sovereignty of a nation without having this basic trust in the society. Somebody has compared this, and I would like to do it because we from Norway, I'm still a Norwegian, we are very close to Finland. I mean, knowing Finland's history. They also have a long border to Soviet Union in the past, and now Russian Federation, like we in Norway have. And how did it come about that Finland was able to secure its sovereignty in such a strong way? The president of Finland was asked about this at the security conference in Munich. And he said, yes, it was very, very difficult after the Second World War, knowing the history of all this. But we were able to secure our sovereignty because we were able to build strong institutions which the Finnish people defended. That was the institutions of the citizens of Finland. So nobody could actually dare to threaten our sovereignty. And during the years it became stronger and stronger, and we were able to build a Finland that also was able to enter the European institutions. Again, democratic security. And believe me, when I'm looking at Europe today, we have many threats. I have mentioned one. But we also have threats like we saw in Ukraine. There are tendencies in many of our member states which goes in the wrong direction. I issued my annual report on the state of human rights and the rule of law before the ministerial meeting in May. And there were 3 major findings, and this is very authoritative, because our findings, our reports are based on our monitoring bodies and the judgment from the Court of Human Rights. So these are convention-based bodies which we, so to say, can look into and make a report on the status of Europe. For instance, the judgment from the Court of Human Rights is it's a telling story on what is the status in each member country. How many judgments do we have from the court? What kind of judgments are coming from the court? In which areas, on which issues? So we can easily see what are the problems in our member states. And based on these judgments and the findings of our convention-based monitoring mechanisms, I could draw the following conclusions. In more than 1/3 of our member states, we do not have an entirely independent judiciary. We don't have independent courts. In some places, corrupted courts. 1/3 of member states. We found that in 1/3 of our member states, we do not have a sufficient level of freedom of media. This is a growing fear that I have. There are many things in this with regard to freedom of media. One thing is that there is a tendency of trying to control the internet in many ways. Another thing is that there are attempts by authorities directly to intervene in the work of the media. And then you have the problem of ownership, concentration of ownership of the media, which is harming the freedom of expression in many places. So you see, there is now a development going in the opposite direction that what is written in the European Convention on Human Rights. And if we do take, the problem in the judiciary and with regard to the media, you see there is a big danger here, because when we talk about separation of power, checks and balances in society, the two most important institutions in this regard is an independent judiciary and an independent media that can hold authorities on account. If that doesn't happen, then we get the same thing which we saw in Ukraine, and ultimately we may get new instability at the European continent. So this is democratic security. So we found these two things, and we found the third thing, which is also worrying, namely that in around half of our member states do not have in place legislation protecting minorities, anti-discrimination legislation. And in this respect, I would like to mention one of the most shameful things at the European continent. This is how we are treating the Roma people in, I would say, all our member countries. Some countries have more Roma people living there permanently than others. Others have them as travelers coming in, like in Oslo, to beg for money during the summertime. But everywhere we see discrimination and even worse things, nearly violent actions against them. Council of Europe is putting in place quite many measures together with the European Union to combat this. We have done it for a number of years, but unfortunately developments have not gone in the right direction. We have other minority problems as well, but I think that how we treat the Roma people is really shameful for Europe. It's the biggest minority on our continent, 12 million people, and how we deal with them is a tragedy, as I see it. So we, together with the European Union, have a very coordinated partnership in order to do more for this ethnic group. But if you put this into a wider context, then I come back to what I said at the outset, that this is a major problem for Europe, which we have always faced on this continent, how to deal with the minorities, us versus them. How do we treat the others? That was always a big challenge for us. That has led to actually not only violence but also wars. And therefore we have to be very attentive on how we handle this in the future. And now we have got a new threat, which is to some extent, I would say, connected to this, namely the threat of terrorism on our own continent, which is of course connected to the tragic situation which we are witnessing around us in Syria, in Libya, and in the Middle East. But this Muslims living on our continent is of course heavily influenced by what they see, where they come from. And they are also heavily influenced by how they are being treated or not treated on this continent. And unfortunately, in some instances, young people are being so-called radicalized, being influenced by these radical terrorist organizations outside Europe. And this is a major problem for the European continent, because many of them live here and are inclined to make terrorist actions on our continent, like we saw in Paris, like we saw in Denmark. And how do we deal with it? I think that, and again, the Council of Europe is heavily involved in this, and it is very much connected to what I'm talking about, namely democratic security. How do we deal with that threat, or how do we deal with people that are planning to make an action, or are taking part in an action? Taking part in an action, of course, this is, I mean, there we don't have any problem with prosecution. If one can prove that you have taken part in a terrorist attack, then of course you will be brought to the court. But how do we deal with people that are planning, have an intention, which we are witnessing now on the European continent, have an intention, planning for taking part in a terrorist action, either abroad or on our own continent? Our basic principle in the rule of law is that you are innocent till you are proven guilty. So how can we prove that people that have an intention to make a terrorist action, how can we prove that they have this intention? How can we bring them, how can we prosecute them? So this is, of course, in our culture, in our understanding of rule of law, a difficulty. And as I said, it's not easier to deal with a terrorist attack, a violent action, but it is much easier to prove it and bring the perpetrators to the court. But now governments, of course, they need now to take preventive action, not only to deal with an action after it has happened, but now because people demand that they will do so, namely to prevent that people go to an action. How do we deal with this in a rule of law way? Well, we took upon this challenge. The Security Council made a resolution in September last year, resolution 2178, which was about this threat. But they didn't say how we should do it. And therefore, the UN Security Council asked the Council of Europe, because we had a very good background for doing it, asked us to find out how we could deal with this problem based on the principle of rule of law, as we see it in Europe. We had, from 2005, the Convention on Combating Terrorism, which actually became a reference document for the European Union and for the United Nations, because we explained how we could take on terrorist attacks, terrorism, based on rule of law. And they asked us, how can we now face this new threat, namely to prevent people to take action, and how can we deal with this in the rule of law, based on rule of law. We have now agreed upon a new additional protocol to our Convention on Combating Terrorism, which explains how authorities should deal with this problem. I'm going to the UN Security Council and to inform them about this now on the 17th of June. And I say this because Europe has always been a continent where we uphold the rule of law. We look how it went when the Americans started the war on terrorism and decided on the Patriotic Act, which made it possible to detain so many people in Guantanamo, which made it possible with the torture in Abu Ghraib. It fueled the whole Arab world, because one combated terrorism without the rule of law, without the basic principles we are built upon here in Europe. And now the United States has realized that this was wrong and passed a new law now in the US Congress and going to the Senate. So I think it's incredibly important that when we are combating a threat, that we do it with the means and based on the principles and values that we have agreed upon and which are enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights. Otherwise, we will get the opposite result. You cannot combat a threat with undemocratic means. That's the old lesson. Now, I think that we need, in the Europe in which we are living today, with so many different tendencies, new wave of nationalism, many places, I think we need to recall why we have this Europe we have today. Why the Czech Republic again became Middle Europe and not Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain. Why do we have this Europe? Well, it came about because of the Second World War and the lessons from this war and the war before that. And the world understood that one had to move from nationalism to internationalism. There was no other way, because one had said so many nationalistic wars. So one had to move away from unrestrained national sovereignty to internationalism. So we got the UN Security Council, or the UN Charter, which established the UN Security Council, and it is said in the Charter that the UN Security Council, the members there, are acting on behalf of all of us to secure peace in the world. What does it mean? It means that one has taken away power from the nation states and moved it to the Security Council. As I see it, it's a tragedy that the Security Council is not taking on this responsibility. Like in Syria, they couldn't agree on anything. So they were not able to fulfill their responsibility to secure peace in the world. But this is written in the UN Charter. So it was a first attempt to restrain the power of the member states, of the nation states. And we got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What does it mean? Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It means that there are certain rights enshrined in this declaration which you have because you are a human being. It's a natural right. These rights do not come from the laws, they come from the fact that you are a human being. So nobody can take it away from you. This is what is said in the Universal Declaration. So it was also restraining the power of the nation state. The nation state did not have any longer the power to harm the rights of individuals when we are talking of the basic human rights. And here in Europe, we made this very concrete by creating the European Convention on Human Rights and the Court of Human Rights, which means that the nation states on this continent not any longer has the right to harm these basic rights mentioned in the convention. So it is restraining the power of the nation state. So this was a new internationalism at the global level, made much more concrete at the European level. And it was a necessity. One has to move away from the concept of full sovereign right for the nation state. This is what we are talking about now when we are discussing what kind of Europe, what kind of world do we want to have. And is this, the Universal Declaration and the Convention on Human Rights is not only a limitation of the power of the nation state, it is also a limitation of the power of the majority inside the nation state. I say this because we are also witnessing another unfortunate tendency, namely that in some of our member countries, the majority think that they have the power to do everything. Somebody has even said that it is a kind of new ideology, namely majoritarianism. If you have got the power from the people, you can do everything you want. But it is not true. The majority of the majority in a society is restrained by the Universal Declaration and the European Convention on Human Rights and the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. So that one doesn't have this power, unrestrained power, to do what one wants. That is the basic thing in the Human Rights Declaration. And this is also very important to keep in mind nowadays, that one can put it even more clear, namely that the majority have an obligation to secure the rights of the minorities. For instance, the Roma people. For instance, the LGBT people, the homosexuals, and other minorities with regard to sex. We have an obligation as a majority to secure the rights of these minorities. And if we don't do that, then the old evil comes back to the European continent, for sure. And as I mentioned, Willy Brandt, he said something very important at the time. He said that in Europe we have learned that security and human rights is for all or for none. It's indivisible. If we don't secure the rights of all, then the rights for everybody is being threatened at the end of the day, which we saw before the war. When we were not able to secure the rights of the Jews and the Roma and the homosexuals, at the end of the day, everybody was threatened. If we are not able to secure the rights of a nation, then we are all threatened. This is what we are witnessing today in Ukraine. So security and human rights is indivisible values. So I will come to an end by saying the following. Very often I'm being, or from time to time I'm being asked, to which ideology do you belong? Well, I say that more and more I belong to the ideology of constitutionalism, which means because I have seen how incredibly important it is for a nation and for a continent like Europe that we have a constitution that everybody can accept, which constitutes fair competition among political parties, which constitutes independent courts, which constitutes the freedom of expression. If one don't have such a constitution, then we get the mess that we saw in Tunisia, even worse in Libya, very bad in Egypt, and also very dramatic in Ukraine. So I belong to constitutionalism. I think it's incredibly important that we get our member states to have solid constitutions, solid institutions, and that we secure the institutions that we have created on the European continent in order to secure human rights and rule of law and peace ultimately. Thank you.
General Secretary, thank you very much for your extremely interesting lecture. Thank you also very much for sharing your personal experiences with us, especially from this very room, and especially your memoirs about meeting the late President Václav Havel. I would like to apologize to the rector of Charles University who had to participate at the family funeral. So I will be moderating now the debate. So the lecture was very interesting, explaining us the relationship between security and protection of human rights and the fact that these both are inseparable. And I would like now to invite you to ask questions, if you would be so kind and introduce yourself first and pose the question. Thank you. Yes, please. The microphone is coming. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sten Šved. I'm the Estonian ambassador here in Prague. And thank you for a very good speech, Mr. Secretary General. You mentioned Ukraine a few times. I just want to ask, how do you see the situation in Russia? Because Russia is also the member of the Council of Europe, and how it adheres to the values and to the convention. Thank you.
If you can please answer.
Yes, I can answer from here then. Yes.
Thank you.
Well, I have also said many times that I believe that if one had in place more separation of power, a more vibrant civil society, more free press, a state Duma that was able to take on its responsibility, having a stronger opposition. I think that having an opposition in the society is a necessity. If you don't have that, which I've spoken about, then you get many bad things. But if one had a stronger opposition that could, so to say, challenge the power, it would not have been so easy to do what Russia did in Crimea and now in eastern Ukraine. That's I think political researchers, they disagree on most things, but they agree on one thing. I've never seen anybody dispute this, namely that democratic societies very seldom go to war with each other. It's not possible. By the way, this is the reason why the committee that I chaired, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, awarded so many human rights activists, because human rights, securing human rights and having a democratic society is securing peace. So Yes, we also work very hard in Russian Federation to establish a more independent judiciary, to secure the rights of the civil society and NGOs. All this, it has become much more difficult after the crisis unfolding in Ukraine, of course, but we cannot give up. And still, I think it's very important that the Russian Federation is a part of a member of the Council of Europe, because it gives 120 million people the right to go to the court in Strasbourg. If they are out, they are out. Also out. Not only the rulers, but also the people are out of Europe. That would be very unfortunate, I think.
Thank you, please.
Thank you. Veronika Bielková, Charles University in Prague. I'm also the member of the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe on behalf of the Czech Republic. First of all, many thanks for the presentation, and thank you also for the annual report, which I read with attention. It's very useful for our work as the Venice Commission. I have two questions. The first one relates to the European Court. You describe the history of the European Court as a history of success. In many respects, it certainly is. At the same time, the European Court does not go unchallenged. There are a couple of countries in Europe which have doubts about the efficiency of the European Court nowadays, and which consider either completely withdrawing from the conventional system or at least repealing the national legislation implementing the European Convention on Human Rights. I was wondering how you assess this development, and in light of it, how you see the prospects of the European Court of Human Rights. Will it become the victim of its own success, or will it survive somehow? So this is the first question. And the second one relates to the European Convention as well, but it concentrates on Ukraine. 2 weeks ago, Ukraine derogated from the European Convention on Human Rights and also from two other instruments, the European Social Charter and the ICCPR. The derogation obviously is not a very commonly used tool in Europe, and moreover, the Ukrainian derogation is quite extensive. By now, I guess it has reached the Council of Europe. So again, I was wondering whether you could share with us some ideas on this derogation. Thank you.
Well, to the last question, we have not got, according to the convention, if a country wants to derogate from articles in the convention, they have to inform the Secretary General. They have not yet done it. We have heard about it for several months, but it never appeared in my office. But it's clear that a member country has the right to do it, but they have to explain why and which articles in the convention which are being suspended. To your two other questions, it is true that a couple of member states are now putting in question judgment from the court whether they should implement them or not. You have seen that there has been a debate about that in the United Kingdom, that the government party had a platform before the election saying that they would scrap the Human Rights Acts, which actually says that the European Court has supremacy in UK judicial system. So this is being now questioned. I don't know what the outcome of this will be, but I think it will be very difficult to get a majority for this in United Kingdom. One should keep in mind also, and that has to do with the democratic security, namely that the Good Friday agreement for Northern Ireland, there it is said that the government of United Kingdom had an obligation to implement the European Convention in the laws for Northern Ireland. So if one questions the European Convention, the supremacy of the European Convention, the Good Friday agreement will get into jeopardy. And the same goes with the Dayton Agreement for Bosnia and Herzegovina. where there is also a clear reference to the European Convention on Human Rights. So it will not be easy to do it, but I mean, if a country like United Kingdom does it, then I think the whole convention system will start to fall apart, I must say, because then others will be inclined to do exactly the same. And the idea which I've heard about is that the rulings of the court in Strasbourg should only have advisory role. But have you heard about a court that has an advisory role? If the courts in Czech Republic become, the rulings of the courts here becomes advisory, do you have rule of law then? No, rule of law means that the court has a final word within the remits of the law. So if one says that the court in Strasbourg only has an advisory role, then we don't have rule of law at the European level any longer. And I think that some member states would probably be inclined to do exactly the same. So this is what I talked about petty nationalism. Because one does not like one or two judgments from the court, then the whole system should be abandoned. And that is really a new development of the European continent. Now, the court itself is, of course, a challenge. That was actually why I came to Strasbourg, because the Norwegian government realized that one had to do a major reform of the whole convention system in order to get it to survive. It was a matter of survival, because the court had 130,000 undeclared cases. And therefore, you know, the pillar in the whole convention system is the individual right to petition to this court. And because of this pending cases, then this individual right to petition to court was not any longer real, because it would take 8 to 10 years to get an application for an individual, and then you don't have a real right to go to the court. So there was a need for making, and all this application came to the court because it became more and more popular. So as we said, it became a victim of its own success. But there was a real need for making reforms. One thing was reforms inside the court, so that the court could deal with applications more speedily. Other thing was that the court should have the right to put aside applications that were clearly not admissible. So we have put in place many of such reforms, which has helped the court a lot. So now, more or less, the court is on the right track. But another thing, and that's what I talked about here, namely that the reason why so many applications comes to the court is that our member states do not have legislation and judicial practices, for instance, in conformity with the European Convention. So therefore, people go to the court in Strasbourg. So I mean, all the applications that do not come from heaven, they come from member states. So therefore, we had to focus on reforms in the member states, so that they could put in place legislation which is in conformity with the Convention, and therefore that the member states could take responsibility for the European Convention at home and not pushing all the things to Strasbourg. So this is what the reforms of the Council of Europe, which I put in place, are about. Namely, that member states, we should push responsibility back to the member states for implementing the European Convention at the national level. Without that, I don't think that the court can survive. So it comes back to the origin of the whole system, namely that we didn't get the court in order to take away responsibility for the member states. We got the court so that the judgment of the court could be used for implementing legislation at the national level in conformity with the convention. So pushing it back to the member states. And this is what we are doing now, and it works. I think that the court is not now on a secure ground. And by the way, your Venice Commission is one of the jewels in our crown, and you are helping our member states a lot in order to do exactly what we are saying, getting in place constitutions and legislation in conformity with the convention.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I see that there is another hand up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jagland, for your interesting speech. I am Latvian ambassador to Prague. I have two observations and remarks and some kind of question. First, you spoke about democracy, corruption, bad governance, oligarchs. In particular, mostly in Central Eastern Europe, we are witnesses about these oligarch influences in different spheres of life. Recently, just the biggest scandal, the HCBS Bank outflow of files as one of examples show that in somehow it's strange that this oligarch system, these anti-democratic values, by means of financial flows, of regulations in wider scope, not only on European level, but globally, not helps to national governments, to national societies to develop good governance, but vice versa. And it was done by help of particular spheres, or particular, let's say, subjects globally. It's very controversial. And what's view Council of Europe on these problematics? And next, you mentioned a lot about Roma people and minorities. I don't fully agree that everywhere is a catastrophic attitude. No, we have also very good examples of integration of minorities, and particularly Roma people. My personal experience is Finland, where I worked. There is a very, very good interaction between a mainstream, let's say, moods in society and nation towards the Roma people and vice versa. Even in my country, mayor of biggest city also is a Roma people, a Roma man, and different positions. They have possibilities. In this respect, it's once again, I like about these financial matters philosophically. Of course, human rights, it's a priori. No discussions or doubts about this. But at the same time, we never heard on, even on European Union or other levels, the word, or very few times, the word responsibilities. Last year, during the award event of Roma projects here in Prague, in Krzyżowatka, there are very good projects in the Czech Republic and very positive developments also. But I would like to remind the words said, and I personally agree, said by European Commissioner Ms. Jourova in her address. Yes, nation in proprio has responsibility to behave in proper way towards all minorities. But at the same time, all minorities have also not only the rights, but also have responsibility. And the second word is somehow not used, maybe due to historical experience, but we cannot avoid, it seems, also this word. What's your vision on that? Thank you very much.
I fully agree with you, but I have to say that the Human Rights Convention is actually about protecting rights and not about responsibilities for the people. But of course, responsibility is very important for everybody to foster. I believe that with rights, full rights, also comes responsibility. But I take your point also that there is a need for a change of culture also within the Roma society. And I think that it would help a lot if these people could be more, on the one hand, get their basic rights, and on the other hand, be more integrated in their societies where they are living. That would, then I think you will see what we have seen with other groups, that when they get their full acceptance in the society, they also take on the responsibility they have for the larger society. Your first problem is, actually, I'm glad you raised it, because we are living in a global world, global economy, and therefore those who want to corrupted people, of course, they can get use of the international networks, which there was a very, very interesting, broad article in the International New York Times yesterday about what happens in Moldova, a small country that has been deprived of such a huge amount of money. Can you imagine? This is threatening the sovereignty of the nation with the help of international financial networks. And therefore, we have two very important instruments, actually the most respected in the world, namely the Convention for Combating Corruption, GRECO, which also has a monitoring mechanism. This is a convention which is also open for countries outside Europe. For instance, the United States is a full member. Others are also members to this convention. The convention is harmonizing legislation in those who are a party to the convention to combat corruption. We also have the Convention on combating what do you call it, money laundering, which has been very instrumental, by the way, for International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. For instance, when we saw the crisis on Cyprus, this is also an important instrument for us, because money laundering, corruption, international crimes is a part of the same picture, actually. So again, Europe has very good instruments if they are being used. And all this constitutes also what is absolutely necessary, namely more cooperation between police authorities over the borders.
Is there another question? Yes, please.
I'm Elena Zabzova from Charles University. I would like to ask you how the NGOs with observative status can help to create Council of Europe new politician views, or new how they can help to make new policy in your respect.
NGOs. Oh, yes. Yeah, NGOs are indispensable in every society, and they are indispensable for us as well. We are drawing very much on their knowledge. They are on the ground constantly, reporting. We draw on them They also, by the way, draw on our knowledge and our reporting, which is very much based, convention-based, and the rulings of the court. So we feed into their knowledge, and we get the knowledge from them. And by the way, the major international NGOs, they take part in some of our steering committees. So there is a very close interaction between the civil society and the Council of Europe. And in the whole reform process, we need the national forces to push authorities to reform the legislation, and in that respect, NGOs, the media, experts, everybody are incredibly important.
Thank you. Are there other questions? If I may, you were talking about the situation in Arabic countries, and you spoke about Arabic Spring, and that the situation now is even worse than it was before, that, if I understood well, that it would be better to avert revolution, but to make step-by-step changes to reform the country. In some press or in some opinions, we can also hear that Europe is blamed also for playing a not extremely positive role. Don't take me bad because I am a Europhile, but what would be your argument for that, to protect the role of Europe here?
I fully recognize that Europe has made a number of mistakes during the years in the Middle East and in the Arab world. Many of the problems that the Arab world has stems from the fact that this area was colonized by European nations, and when they withdraw, the borders were drawn artificially, and during all the year, and they get authoritarian rulers, which were supported to the very end. There was not very much push for reforms. On the other hand, one needed them for security reasons. We have had the Israeli-Palestinian conflict going on for decades after decades, which of course has influenced the Arab Street a lot. I don't believe that the bombing of Libya was very successful. There was no following up. There was no idea on how one should put in place a new system there, so the whole society disintegrated with a tragic result, which we haven't. I might say we have not yet seen the full consequences of this, for them and for us. It's only the beginning. What the consequence of disintegration of Libya? Weapons are being spread all over North Africa. Influencing and creating chaos in Chad and other countries on the Horn of Africa. So and then you have Syria. I don't think that the policy we pursued was very successful either. Now we have a tragic situation that well, a full civil war with so many refugees, and this is now affecting our own continent. So, well, I can understand that Europe is being blamed. Well, the revolution in Tunisia was inevitable. I mean, it came about because people couldn't tolerate any longer this system. I don't see how we could do it differently, and how we could reform Libya or well, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, but it proves that if we are not able to do it, the alternative to reform is revolution. And very often when a revolution comes, the revolution is being picked up by extremist forces, like it happened in Russia. The Kerensky revolution was hijacked by Lenin and turned it into a dictatorship. The same happened in Iran. There was a democratic revolution there in 1979, but it was hijacked by Khomeini and his people and turned it into a dictatorship. So, I mean, revolution very often becomes inevitable, but not always successful. But for the European continent, I would say that all the member states can be reformed, or we can avoid such a development in all of the member states, because we don't have any pure dictatorship in any of our member states. So therefore, we have to be reform-oriented and not aiming for revolutions.
Yeah. So I think that another question.
No? Okay. Now it's working. Mr. Jagland, what do you think should be done with member states of the Council of Europe that continue to violate the Council of Europe standards and do not fulfill the obligations stemming from membership in the Council of Europe? Of course, as you may know, there's a specific example of Azerbaijan. Don't you think that a new mechanism is needed to be put in place in order somehow to deal with such member states? Because with Azerbaijan continuing to violate the Council of Europe standards, basically the legitimacy of the Council is being eroded. How do you respond to this?
Actually, we have such a mechanism already. If you are thinking about suspending a member country, it has been done before with Greece when we had the military junta. With Turkey, when military takeover was done there. But it is not a development that I want to use. There is, of course, a red line, which the Greek and the Turkish example shows. But when we talk about suspending a member country or expelling a member country, then we are expelling all its inhabitants and their right to go to the international court. And that should be absolutely the last thing we should do. We have to, I mean, we are living now on the European continent where we should not start expelling each other. We should try to do as much as we can to include each other. And our way of inclusion is that we work with member states in order to get them to change their habits, their laws, their judicial practices. We have to do our utmost. It is extremely difficult, for instance, when it comes to the country you mentioned, Azerbaijan, but we have no other option than to try.
Thank you. I will ask for last question, Mr. Fritsch, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. My name is Jindřich Fritsch. I, on one side, represent the Minister of Education, Youth and Sports, and on the other side, I'm a chair of the Steering Committee for Educational Policies and Practice of the Council of Europe. It was very interesting, and I congratulate you to your lecture. My question is definitely focused on education and on role of education in the Council of Europe work. I think there is a stable position of education in the last decades, and I see importance of that field for future development also. You spoke about corruption. I think we have a very clear mandate from the last ministerial conference in this field, and we are going slowly to launch ETINET, which is a pan-European platform on integrity and ethics in education. And we see that for future it's necessary also to foster and to support so-called cross-sector approach in the Council of Europe work. How do you see such a development? Is it also linked to your policy, and how you see the role of education in the Council of Europe work?
Well, I see. In my mind, education becomes more and more important as I see problems on our continent evolving. First of all, I think there is a need for us to get the young people to understand the values which we built upon on this continent. We cannot take it for given that they know the whole history of our continent, why we got these values, what they are about. So that's one thing. But now, when we have become so diverse, this becomes even more important. And when we think about how to take on these young people that are inclined to take part in a terrorist act, either abroad or here in Europe, we need to, in a way, to come in contact with them. Many of them live in what has been called parallel societies, or a parallel universe. I was at the summit which President Obama called for in White House on combating terrorism in the winter. And there was one thing which one man from Syria, an imam, a scholar from Syria, that had an intervention which I noticed very much and I always come back to. He said that the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims, we are called the people of the book. I mean, we refer to the book, the Bible and the Quran. So therefore we are called the people of the book. But very few people read the book nowadays. They got the interpretation or the distortion of the book through these extreme networks on the internet. So these young people, they have no understanding of the Quran, but they get the interpretation of the distortion of Islam in prisons, on the internet, when they socialize where they live. So how do we reach out to these people? I think education, the school system is incredibly important. Therefore, we are now working out a new, what can I say, benchmarks or how we teach young people how to become democratic citizens. We have that when it comes to how we teach languages in European schools, which has become very important for, I think, across the continent for schools. And now we are trying to do the same with regard to how do we teach young people to become democratic citizens. And then, of course, we need to touch upon what is the role of religion, what is being said in the Quran, what does it mean really to be a part of a society. So for me, education is becoming more and more important in the context of the mandate of the Council of Europe.
So, Mr. Secretary General, I would like to thank you very much for your interesting lecture and for the debate. I would also like to thank you for your important work. And I would like to pass to you a small present from Charles University, and then I will ask you to sign the book. So.